There is a specific kind of silence in a neurological intensive care unit that is not actually silence at all. It is a manufactured quiet, a synthetic approximation of calm, assembled from the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator, pushing measured breaths into lungs that have forgotten how to draw air on their own, from the steady electronic percussion of a heart monitor, translating a pulse into a green line of peaks and valleys on a glowing screen, from the low automated sigh of the blood pressure cuff inflating and deflating on a thin arm every 15 minutes, like a creature checking whether something is still alive. It is the sound of machines doing the work that a body has temporarily or perhaps permanently surrendered. It is the sound that tells you the only thing standing between your child and the dark is a wall of equipment and the expertise of strangers. Renata Cole had worked in hospitals for 22 years. She had stood in rooms exactly like this one on the other side, the professional side, the composed side, more times than she could count. She had held the hands of mothers who looked the way she imagined she must look right now. She had spoken in the careful, measured tones of clinical reassurance. She had used phrases like stable but critical, and we're monitoring closely, and she's a fighter, and she had meant every word, had delivered each one with genuine compassion, because she understood that those phrases were the small life preservers that kept a drowning person from going under in the first terrible hours. She understood them differently now from this side of the bed. She understood that they were true and insufficient at the same time. The room smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic undercurrent that every hospital room carried, no matter how thoroughly it was cleaned, a smell that lived in the walls and the floors and the plastic tubing that connected living bodies to the machines monitoring them. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed almost imperceptibly. Renata could feel that buzz in her back teeth. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her daughter. Aaliyah Cole was 20 years old. She was a junior at Harwell State University, studying urban planning, a discipline she had chosen at 17, after watching a documentary about how poorly designed infrastructure trapped poverty in communities and allowed it to compound across generations. She had a 3.8 GPA, a merit scholarship that covered 60% of her tuition, and a habit of leaving detailed handwritten notes in the margins of her textbooks as though she were arguing with the authors. She had a laugh that came from somewhere deep and genuine, and arrived without warning, a sudden bright sound that made everyone nearby turn their heads. She called her mother every Tuesday and Thursday evening, between 7 and 8, without fail, not because Renata had asked her to, but because Aaliyah had decided that consistency in small things was a form of respect for the people who loved you. She weighed 122 pounds. She had never been in a fight. What lay in the hospital bed in front of Renata was not entirely recognizable as her daughter. The swelling had transformed Aaliyah's face into something alien and terrible. The left orbital bone, the delicate arch of bone that cradles the eye, had been fractured, collapsing the socket inward so that the eye on that side was lost inside a purple-black mass of tissue that had bloomed and thickened into something grotesque. The right side of her jaw was swollen to twice its natural size. Both lips were split. A thick plastic breathing tube was taped to the corner of her mouth, connected by corrugated tubing to the ventilator that stood at the bedside like a faithful mechanical sentinel, pushing air into the collapsed lung with patient indifference. 3 broken ribs, a ruptured spleen that had required emergency surgery in the 2 hours before Renata arrived. Severe cerebral hemorrhaging that had required the neurology team to place Aaliyah in a medically induced coma to reduce the brain swelling before it caused irreversible damage. The official police report, which Renata would not read until the following morning, described the incident as a necessary use of force during a hostile resistance to lawful detention. Renata looked at the bruised, broken face of her honor roll daughter and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was grief. A grief so vast and physical that it pressed down on her chest and compressed her lungs from the inside, a grief that was not yet fully real, because the mind protects itself from the full weight of certain truths by admitting them in increments, and so it had the quality of something observed from a very slight distance. Even though she was standing 2 feet from the bed, the grief would come for her fully later in the weeks ahead, in moments she did not expect. It would find her in the hospital parking garage and in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, and at 3:47 in the morning, staring at a ceiling she could not see. It would come for her completely. She knew this. The second thing was cold. It was not anger, not yet, not the hot and disorganizing fury that grief sometimes generates in its early stages. It was something more mineral than that, something that settled into her bones and calcified there, hard and dense and permanent, the way calcium deposits form around an old injury. A cold, structural rage. A rage with weight and patience, and the particular clarity of purpose that comes to people who have spent a decade and a half learning exactly how evidence is built, how it is preserved, how it is destroyed, and how it survives the attempts to bury it. The Harwell Police Department believed they had silenced a nobody. They had not calculated for what that nobody used to be. The phone had rung at 2:22 in the morning. Renata had been asleep for 3 hours, which was relatively good for her. She was a charge nurse on the trauma ICU floor at Harwell General Hospital, which meant her relationship with sleep was adversarial and irregular, governed entirely by the rhythms of crisis rather than by her own preferences. She had learned to fall asleep quickly and wake completely, the way people do who have spent years being called into emergencies at hours that the rest of the world considers inhuman. When the phone rang, she was awake before the second ring. The caller ID read Harwell Memorial Hospital, which was the other hospital, the one on the north side of the city, the one her daughter had been driving past on her way home from her study group at the university library. The voice on the other end was clinical and detached, the voice of a hospital administrator in the middle of a difficult call at 2 in the morning, carefully stripped of the warmth that might invite extended conversation or emotional escalation. "Is this Renata Cole?" "Yes." "Who is this?" "This is the patient services coordinator at Harwell Memorial. Your daughter Aaliyah Cole has been admitted to our emergency department. She is in critical condition. You need to come to the hospital immediately." There was more after that, some information about which entrance, which floor, who to ask for. Renata heard the words and committed them to the functional part of her brain that operates independently of shock. She was already out of bed before the call ended, already pulling on the clothes that lay over the chair beside her dresser, the jeans and the sweatshirt she had left there earlier. Her hands did not shake. This was the training in her 22 years of walking into crisis rooms and functioning at a high level regardless of what her nervous system was doing beneath the surface. The training did not know that this time was different. It just engaged. The drive was 12 minutes. She did not remember any of it. She remembered the sound of the tires on the wet asphalt of the hospital parking structure. She remembered the smell of the emergency department antiseptic and something else, something organic and sharp, when the automatic doors parted to let her through. She remembered demanding to see her daughter and the way the face of the triage nurse behind the desk shifted into the expression she herself had worn hundreds of times, the careful, compassionate expression of someone about to deliver information that would change a person's life. Dr. Elaine Foster was a colleague. They had worked together for 8 years. Elaine was a trauma surgeon, one of the best in the hospital, a compact, gray-haired woman who did not waste words and did not flinch from difficult truths. She appeared from a side corridor and took Renata's arm and steered her gently but firmly away from the desk and toward the family alcove beside the vending machines. And Renata knew from the way Elaine held her arm, not guiding, not leading, but steadying, that whatever was coming was going to require steadying. Elaine could not meet her eyes at first. "Renata, it's bad," she told her. The injuries, the surgical intervention on the spleen, the decision to induce coma, the neurology team's assessment of the hemorrhage and hemorrhaging. She delivered each piece with the precision of a surgeon, careful, accurate, nothing omitted, and Renata received each piece and added it to the picture she was building with the same precision because she was also a professional, also trained to hold information without dissolving, even information this catastrophic. Then Elaine said it. She was beaten. "Renata." A pause. "The police brought her in." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. The police are the ones who did this. Renata found her own way to the ICU. She did not wait for an escort. She knew every corridor of every hospital in this city, the way a person knows the geography of their own neighborhood by instinct and repetition and long familiarity. She pushed through the double doors and moved down the hall and found the room number she had been given, and she stood in the doorway for 1 full second before walking in. The machines spoke in their mechanical language. The ventilator breathed. The monitor traced its green line. Renata went to the bed. She did not make a sound. She looked at the face of her daughter. The real face, the one she knew buried somewhere inside the ruin of swollen tissue and bruising. And she held the one hand that was accessible, the right hand, the one that wasn't connected to the IV line, and she looked at Aaliyah's closed eyes and thought very precisely and clearly, "I am going to find out exactly what they did to you." The heavy footstep behind her broke the quiet of the room. She turned. Officer Dale Pruitt was leaning against the doorframe with the particular comfort of a man who considered himself a permanent fixture in every room he entered. He was broad across the shoulders, with a thick neck and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something dense and uninteresting. His dark uniform was perfectly pressed. His badge caught the light from the corridor. He was chewing gum with a slow, rhythmic indifference, and he was looking at Renata with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite boredom, but occupied the ugly territory between the two. He was 44 years old. He had been a police officer for 17 years in Harwell County. Inside the department, the younger officers called him the Collector, though not in his presence and not in any way that suggested the name was affectionate. "You, the mother," he asked. "What did you do to my daughter?" Renata's voice was low and very controlled. A tremor ran beneath it that she did not allow to reach the surface. Pruitt's expression did not change. He unhooked his thumbs from his duty belt and resettled them, a small proprietary gesture, the gesture of a man adjusting his ownership of a space. "Your kid made some bad choices tonight, ma'am." His tone was that of someone explaining something unfortunate, but ultimately irrelevant. "We stopped her for a broken tail light on Garfield Road. She became erratic, aggressive, refused to comply with lawful orders. When my partner and I attempted to detain her, she went for my weapon." He shrugged, a single fluid motion that contained his entire evaluation of the situation. "We had to use subduing force. It's unfortunate, but she brought it on herself." Renata looked at him. She looked at the badge. She looked at his face. A broken tail light. She heard her own voice say the words as though testing whether they were real. "She weighs 120 pounds. She has never been in a fight in her life. You expect me to believe that she attacked 2 armed police officers over a traffic stop? I don't expect anything, ma'am." The warmth that had briefly approximated politeness was gone. Something cooler replaced it. He took a step into the room, just one step calculated to demonstrate that he could, that the space was his to enter, regardless of what she preferred. "I'm telling you what's in the report. Maybe you didn't know your daughter as well as you thought you did. Kids get into things. Bad stuff, bad crowds, sometimes substances. The investigation will confirm it was a clean stop." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the room, and she heard his boots on the linoleum going away down the corridor, a heavy, unhurried sound, the sound of a man who felt the ground was solid beneath his feet in every direction. Renata turned back to the bed. She reached out and held her daughter's hand with both of hers. The machines kept their rhythm. The ventilator breathed. Outside in the corridor, voices moved past. The hospital continued its nighttime operations with its customary seamless efficiency, indifferent to the transformation that was happening in this particular room, in this particular woman, at this particular moment. The terrified mother had walked through that door. Something else was standing at the bedside now. "I'm going to find out what they did to you." Baby Renata whispered into the mechanical quiet, her voice barely above the threshold of sound. "And I am going to make them pay for every single thing." She did not leave the hospital that night. She sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed and watched the monitors and held Aaliyah's hand through the small hours of the morning while the hospital moved through its nocturnal rhythms around her. The soft exchanges of the nursing shift changed the distant announcement over the PA, the squeak of a supply cart being wheeled down a corridor somewhere, She was a nurse. She understood everything she was seeing on those monitors. She knew what the numbers meant and what the trends indicated, and what the team of physicians overseeing Aaliyah's care were measuring and managing. She cataloged the information with the clinical part of her brain that was always running, that could not be shut off because it was built into the architecture of who she was after 22 years. The other part of her brain, the part that was Aaliyah's mother, that had packed school lunches and helped with geometry homework and driven to dance recitals and sat up at night when her daughter ran a fever. That part stayed very quiet and watched the breathing tube and counted the mechanical breaths and did not think too far ahead. By 6 in the morning, she had drunk 3 cups of the terrible coffee from the family lounge down the hall and had begun to think about the intersection of Garfield Road and Silo Street. She had driven that road thousands of times. It was not a route that made sense for Aaliyah coming home from the university library. The university was on the west side of the city. Garfield Road and its intersection with the Silo Street were on the eastern industrial edge, a stretch of old warehouse district and shuttered light manufacturing facilities that nobody drove through on a Tuesday night at 1:30 in the morning unless they had a specific reason. The police report said Aaliyah had been pulled over there for a broken taillight. Renata sat with that fact and turned it over. The way a geologist turns a piece of rock, looking at its surfaces, examining its composition, checking its properties against what she knew the material should look like if it were genuine. It didn't look genuine. Thursday arrived with a gray and indifferent sky. Renata was back at the hospital by 7:30, having gone home briefly to change clothes and feed the cat and stand under a hot shower for 7 minutes without really registering the water. She took up her post in the chair beside Aaliyah's bed and watched the overnight nursing staff give their reports and hand off care to the day team, and she exchanged quiet professional acknowledgments with the nurses and the attending neurologist, and she asked precise questions and received precise answers and took notes in the small spiral-bound notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. At 9:15, her phone showed her the news. Chief Raymond Stahl held his press conference in front of the Harwell Police Department's main entrance at 9 o'clock sharp, standing at the department's official podium beneath the department's seal, flanked by Captain Marcus Greer and the department's union liaison. A compact man in a suit who stood slightly behind and to the left of the chief and watched the assembled press with the watchful neutrality of someone managing an insurance claim. Stahl was 59 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of a face that had been carefully arranged over many years into an expression of deep, authoritative integrity. He had held his position for 11 years. He had survived 3 administrations and 2 major scandals, and a federal audit that had examined the department's asset seizure practices and found the report concluded with careful language areas requiring further clarification. He was politically connected in ways that were both extensive and largely invisible, like the root system of a very old tree. The Harwell Police Department is committed to transparency and to the safety of every member of our community, Stahl said into the microphones, and his voice was the voice of an institution reassuring itself. Regarding the incident on Tuesday evening involving 20-year-old Aaliyah Cole, preliminary internal review indicates that Officers Pruitt and Webb acted strictly within departmental use of force guidelines. The subject exhibited extreme hostility under what our investigators suspect may have been the influence of controlled substance and posed an immediate threat to the safety of both officers on the scene. A reporter from the Harwell Courier raised her hand. Chief Stahl, the family is alleging that the injuries are inconsistent with standard detainment procedures and constitute severe police brutality. Will you release the body camera footage from both officers for independent review? Stahl's expression managed to convey simultaneously both deep regret and resolute calm. Unfortunately, due to a highly unusual technical malfunction in our department's server synchronization system, that evening, the body camera footage from Officers Pruitt and Webb was lost before it could be archived. However, our technical team has recovered audio fragments from the incident that corroborate the officers' accounts. Renata, sitting in the ICU chair with her phone in her lap, read the words on the screen of the local news live blog twice. Audio fragments that corroborate the officers' accounts. She had processed evidence for 11 years. She knew what a corrupted file looked like on a departmental server. She also knew what a manually deleted file looked like, and she knew the difference between the two. and she knew that the Harwell PD's server infrastructure was a patchwork system that had been held together with administrative tape and declining maintenance budgets for the better part of a decade. And she knew with the specific granular certainty of someone who had watched the department's evidence practices from the inside for over a decade exactly what highly unusual technical malfunction most likely meant. She put her phone face down on the armrest of the chair. She looked at her daughter's still ventilator-assisted face. She picked up her notebook and her pen. The media assassination followed the press conference by approximately 3 hours. Anonymous sources described by the outlets as law enforcement officials familiar with the investigation began providing background information to several local media organizations. The information centered on Aaliyah Cole's prior record. She had been cited at 16 for trespassing, the citation arising from her presence at a house party where alcohol was served to minors. She had not been drinking. The homeowner had been cited. Aaliyah's citation had been expunged when she turned 18, as juvenile records routinely were under state law. By 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon, 3 local news websites and 1 regional television station had published versions of the story that described Aaliyah as a young woman with a history of poor decision-making and prior police contact that suggested the circumstances of the Tuesday evening stop might reflect a pattern of behavior, and that quoted law enforcement sources describing the encounter as one in which officers had been genuinely in fear for their safety. They were building the story piece by piece. Renata recognized the architecture of it. The anonymous sourcing, the selective framing, the strategic deployment of a sealed juvenile record that someone inside the department had accessed and leaked to the press in violation of state confidentiality law. She had watched this construction happen before from the periphery during her years processing evidence for the county. She had seen it applied to other people's children. She had noted it with discomfort and continued her work because the levers of resistance available to a county forensic technician who observed something troubling were limited, and the institutional pressure to look forward rather than backward was constant and heavy. She was not a county forensic technician anymore. She was the mother of the person the story was being built around. Civil rights attorney Gerald Okafor arrived at her kitchen table at 6 o'clock Thursday evening. He was 54 years old, black, and had spent the better part of 2 decades fighting uphill battles against the institutional weight of underfunded public defender offices and overfunded police union legal teams. He was sharp and overworked and honest in the particular way that people become honest when they have been disappointed by institutional processes too many times to maintain useful illusions about them. He had taken Renata's call Wednesday morning and had been reviewing the sparse official documentation ever since. He spread the papers on her kitchen table and rubbed his temples. "Renata, I need to be completely honest with you," he said. "This department is corrupt in ways that run deep, and Chief Stahl has relationships with the district attorney's office and with Judge Birch's court that mean any complaint we file locally is going to face significant headwinds. Without the body camera footage, which they have now attributed to a technical failure, the core of the case is Aaliyah's account against 2 decorated officers." He paused. "And Aaliyah can't give her account right now, so they just get away with it." She said it flatly, not as a question, testing the words. "I'm filing a preservation order for all dispatch logs, GPS vehicle tracking data, and personnel files," Gerald said. "But they will stonewall. They will file administrative delays. They will route every request through channels that happen to be controlled by the same people who are being investigated. They are banking on you running out of money and emotional resources before the process runs out of procedural obstacles. They are relying on me feeling helpless." Yes, Renata looked at him across the table, at the papers, at the sparse, inadequate official record of what had been done to her daughter. "They picked the wrong mother," she said. She said it quietly, without drama, with the same tone she might have used to note that rain was expected tomorrow. Gerald heard something in it that made him look at her more carefully, trying to understand what he was hearing, and she didn't explain it because she didn't need to explain it to him yet. She needed to go to Garfield Road. She drove to the intersection at 11 o'clock Thursday night. She told no one she was going. She parked 2 blocks away in the lot of a shuttered dry cleaning establishment whose sign had been sun-bleached to illegibility. and she walked the remaining distance with a heavy flashlight in her hand and the particular alert stillness she had developed over years of working crime scenes in the early hours of the morning, a quietness in the body, an economy of movement, a constant peripheral awareness. The intersection of Garfield Road and Silo Street was deep in the Eastern Industrial District, a neighborhood that the city's economic development plans had been theoretically addressing for 15 years without producing any visible results. The buildings here were large and empty, or large and barely occupied warehouses and processing facilities from an industrial era that had relocated or collapsed or transformed into something that required fewer workers and less physical space. The streetlights were amber sodium lamps, old, some flickering, some dark entirely. The asphalt was cracked and patched and cracked again. It smelled of old engine oil and the particular dry dustiness of buildings that had been closed for years. She walked the intersection slowly, casting the beam of the flashlight across the road surface at a low angle, the way you illuminate surface details in forensic photography, not overhead, which flattens, but from the side, which makes texture and irregularity visible. The street sweepers had been thorough. She would have expected nothing less. When she had worked crime scenes, she had always been aware and had noted it in her procedural documentation and had mentioned it in training sessions when she later supervised newer technicians that perpetrators who were sophisticated enough to sanitize the primary scene often underestimated the perimeter. They focused their attention on the immediate visible evidence, the blood and the glass and the tire marks. And they forgot that the world surrounding a crime scene continued to exist and to observe. She stood at the center of the intersection and turned in a slow, complete circle, scanning every facade in every direction. The building immediately at the intersection's northwest corner was a dark-windowed former textile mill, its windows boarded and its signage removed. Directly adjacent to it, sharing a wall and fronting on Silo Street, was a tire recapping operation called Briley's Recap and Storage. It had the closed, slightly defeated appearance of a business that was still technically operating, but doing so on the very edge of viability. A chain-link fence ran along its property line, a gate secured with a padlock, a hand-lettered sign that said, "No parking tow zone anytime." And there, mounted high on a corrugated iron pole that rose from the fence line, positioned at an angle that gave it a clear view across the full width of the intersection, was a camera. It was small, old by the look of it. The housing was weathered and slightly rusted at the mounting bracket. But the indicator light at the back of the unit, she had to look carefully, had to block the ambient glow of the amber streetlights with her hand to see it clearly blinked a faint rhythmic red. Active. Renata stood in the dark intersection and looked up at the camera for a long moment. She thought about angles and fields of view. She thought about storage capacity and loop duration and the properties of night vision-capable sensors in low-cost commercial security equipment. She thought about what could be seen from that angle, from that height pointed in that direction at 1:30 in the morning. She took 3 photographs of the camera, the pole, the angle, the relative position to the intersection. She noted the camera model from the partial label visible on the housing. She looked up the model on her phone, standing in the street, 4mm wide-angle lens, motion-activated recording with a continuous backup mode standard loop of 7 days, For overwriting, 7 days. The incident had been 4 days ago. She had approximately 72 hours before the footage would be overwritten. She walked back to her car with a steady pace and a completely calm exterior, and the cold, dense, mineralizing certainty of a woman who has just found what she was looking for. She did not sleep. She drove back to the hospital at 2 in the morning and sat with Aaliyah for 4 hours, holding her daughter's hand and watching the monitors and talking to her very quietly. Not about the investigation, not about what had happened, but about small things, the kind of things they talked about on their Tuesday and Thursday phone calls. The apartment Aaliyah was planning to rent with 2 of her classmates next fall. The professor whose lectures Aaliyah had described as like watching someone think in real time, which is terrifying and fascinating at the same time. The design project Aaliyah had been working on for her urban planning seminar, a proposal for retrofitting a mixed-income neighborhood that incorporated green infrastructure and maximized natural light in a high-density residential context. Renata talked, and the machines answered in their own language, and the night passed. At 6:30, she went home and showered and changed and ate half a piece of toast standing over the kitchen sink. She made a phone call at 7. She drove across the city at 7:45 with the specific focus of someone who has a task clearly defined and a closing window in which to accomplish it. Briley's recap and storage did not open until 8. She was parked outside at 7:55. The man who arrived to unlock the gate at 8:03 was Frank Briley himself. She could tell from the way he moved through the space the proprietary familiarity of an owner. The way he went directly to the specific things that needed to be checked without looking for them. He was in his mid-60s, a heavily built man with hands that bore the permanent evidence of decades of physical work, with a gray bristle of beard and eyes that were alert and wary in the particular way of someone who had learned that wariness was a practical survival tool in this district and in his dealings with the authorities who were supposed to serve it. Renata got out of her car and crossed to the gate. He looked at her with the careful, neutral assessment of a man who is waiting to see what category of trouble was presenting itself. "Mr. Briley," she said, "my name is Renata Cole. My daughter Aaliyah Cole was severely beaten by 2 police officers at the intersection directly in front of your property on Tuesday night. She is in a coma at Harwell Memorial Hospital. I noticed you have a security camera on that pole." She pointed. "I need to know if it records, and I need to see what it recorded." Something moved through his face. Not quite recognition because he had not known her before, but a kind of alignment, the look of a man hearing information that connected to something he already carried. He studied her for several seconds. "I saw something on the news," he said. "They said she attacked the officers." "They are lying," Renata said. "She is a 20-year-old architecture student who weighs 122 pounds and has never been in a fight in her life. She is in a medically induced coma with 3 broken ribs and a fractured orbital bone and a ruptured spleen. And the body cameras that might have recorded the truth were, according to the police department, lost in a server malfunction." Frank Briley looked at her for a long time. He looked at the camera on the pole. He looked back at her. "Those 2 officers," he said, and his voice carried something complicated in it. "Pruitt and Webb. They run this district like it's their private property. I had a situation with them 2 years ago. Tried to file a complaint." He stopped. "Judge Birch's court dismissed it in 4 days. Didn't even look at the evidence." "I know," Renata said, "and I know how to make sure what your camera recorded cannot be dismissed. I spent 11 years as a forensic evidence technician for Harwell County. I know how to preserve this footage so that it is federally admissible and cannot be touched by anyone in this city's judicial system." She held his gaze. "But I have 72 hours before your system overwrites it." He was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then he stepped back and held the gate open. "Come in," he said, "and make sure nobody sees you come through this gate." The back office of Briley's recap and storage smelled of stale cigarette smoke and old paper, and the oil and rubber smell that had permeated the building's walls over decades of use. It was a small room crowded with filing cabinets and shelving stacked with parts catalogs and tire spec binders, with a scarred wooden desk in the center, and a dusty desktop computer that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the previous decade's middle years. Frank Briley closed the door and pulled the blinds on the single window that looked out onto the main floor. He moved with a deliberateness that Renata recognized as the movements of someone who had learned to be careful when certain things were being discussed. "I don't want any trouble with the OPD," he said, settling into the chair in front of the computer. "I want to be honest with you about that. Pruitt and Webb, they come through here, not as customers. They come through because this district is their territory, and they like businesses on their territory to know that." "I understand," Renata said. "If they find out I helped you, there are things that can happen to a business like this." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. "Mr. Briley," Renata said, "what they did to my daughter is on that camera. Without it, 2 officers who beat a 20-year-old girl nearly to death walk away with their careers and their pensions intact. With it, they don't walk away at all." She paused, "but only if the footage is preserved correctly. That is what I'm here to do." He looked at the computer screen, then back at her. Whatever final internal calculation he was making, It completed itself in the privacy of his own expression. "Camera runs 24 hours, he said. Black and white standard resolution, no audio. Loops weekly. Tuesday night. What time? Approximately 1:30 a.m. He navigated through the DVR interface, clunky old but functional, and dragged the timeline back to the early hours of Tuesday morning. The monitor showed the intersection in the grainy, slightly washed-out tones of night vision footage, the amber streetlights creating pools of brightness against the surrounding dark. At 1:31 a.m., a small sedan. Aaliyah's Honda Civic rolled into the frame from the western approach and came to a stop at the red light. They both watched the screen. 22 seconds later, an unmarked black Tahoe came in fast from the north, moving with a deliberate aggression that was nothing like the approach of a vehicle responding to a traffic violation. It cut in front of the Honda and stopped at an angle that blocked it in boxing the smaller car against the curb. Two figures emerged from the Tahoe. Frank Briley leaned forward. The two figures did not approach the driver's window of the Honda. This was the detail that Renata had expected, and that was in the specific context of a traffic stop entirely wrong. A traffic stop begins at the driver's window. You approach, you make contact, you explain the stop, you request documentation. You do not get out of your vehicle and walk in the opposite direction. The two figures walked to the rear of their own vehicle and opened the cargo area. One of them, broad, heavy-shouldered, the build she recognized, extracted a large duffel bag from the trunk and held it at his side. A third vehicle arrived at the intersection from the eastern approach, a silver Mercedes sedan with tinted windows, moving quietly and without haste, the way expensive cars move when their drivers are accustomed to arriving exactly when they intend to arrive. It stopped adjacent to the Tahoe. A door opened. A figure stepped out. The streetlight was positioned directly above the intersection, and it fell fully on the third man's face as he stepped from the car and moved to Aaliyah was Pruitt. Frank Briley made a sound that was not quite a word. The man in the streetlight was Leonard Birch, 63 years old, white-haired, distinguished in the particular way of institutional authority, the judge who had sat on the Harwell County bench for 19 years. Who signed the warrants, who dismissed the complaints, who presided over the sentencing of the people brought before him by the same officers who were at this moment on a dark intersection at 1:30 in the morning, handing him a duffel bag in exchange for a thick envelope. The exchange took approximately 45 seconds. The envelope went to Pruitt. The duffel went into the trunk of the Mercedes. Birch returned to his car and the Mercedes began to pull away. At that moment on the screen in the Honda, small, barely visible, a dark silhouette in the driver's seat, something moved. A faint, brief illumination. A phone screen raised and pointed toward the windshield. Pruitt saw it. Even in the grainy footage, the change in his posture was immediate and unmistakable. He turned sharply, pointing at the Honda with a rigid arm. The Mercedes accelerated and disappeared from the frame. Webb closed the trunk. Both officers drew their weapons and moved toward the Honda at a run. "Oh, Lord," Frank Briley said softly. Renata watched the next 2 minutes and 47 seconds in complete silence. She had worked crime scenes for 11 years. She had processed the aftermath of violence many times. She had photographed injuries and cataloged evidence and written reports that described in the precise and detached language of forensic documentation what human beings were capable of doing to each other. She had developed the professional capacity to observe those things and continue functioning. She was not functioning as a forensic technician right now. She was Aaliyah's mother. She did not look away from the screen because she had come here to witness this and to know it in its full, undeniable specificity, and because looking away would have been a dishonesty she could not afford. She watched Kessler Webb. She corrected herself. The man she now knew as Webb shatter the driver's window with the grip of his weapon. She watched Pruitt reach through the broken window and unlock the door and drag her daughter out by the arm. She watched Aaliyah hit the pavement. She watched her daughter raise her hands, both hands open and flat, and empty the gesture of total surrender. The gesture that should have been the end of it, that should have been the moment the officers stepped back. They did not step back. She watched what happened next, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and the tears ran down her face in silence. When the footage ended, Pruitt picking up the phone from the asphalt, slipping it into his pocket, Webb dragging Aaliyah's limp form to the side of the car. The perfunctory radio call, Renata stood very still for several seconds. Then she opened the notebook she had brought with her. "Mr. Briley," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and entirely controlled. "I need you to witness what I'm about to do, and I need you to sign the documentation I'm going to prepare. This footage needs to be preserved with a complete chain of custody from this moment forward. I'm going to timestamp a hash of the original file, and I need the original DVR unit bagged and labeled. And I need you to write a signed statement confirming that the device has been in your continuous possession since the installation date and has not been modified or accessed except by you, and as of this morning, by me." Frank Briley stared at her. "You know how to do all that. I spent 11 years teaching county forensic technicians how to do it," Renata said. "Yes." He got up and found her a pen. She worked for 2 hours in that back office. She had brought materials in the bag she carried, not the tools of a break-in, not the instruments of revenge, but the materials of documentation. Evidence bags, tamper-evident labels, a small portable forensic drive with write-blocking capability that she had kept when she left the county evidence office, along with her other equipment because she was the kind of person who kept her tools. A digital timestamp application that logged cryptographic hashes, unique fingerprints of digital files, so that any subsequent copy could be proven to be identical to the original, and any modification could be detected. She worked with the methodical efficiency of long practice, explaining each step to Frank Briley as she did it, because his understanding and his contemporaneous account of the process would form part of the evidentiary record. She copied the footage to the forensic drive. She generated a hash of the original file and a hash of the copy and recorded both with the timestamp. She photographed the DVR unit before and after bagging it. She prepared the chain of custody documentation, the paperwork that would allow a federal court to follow the evidence from the moment of its creation to the moment it was presented, with every hand that had touched it accounted for and every transfer documented. Frank Briley signed everything she put in front of him. When they were done, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had moved past wariness into something more like respect. "That footage," he said. "The man in the streetlight. That was Judge Birch." "Yes. You're going after the judge, too." "I'm going after everyone. That tape is evidence of," Renata said. She placed the forensic drive carefully in the inner zippered pocket of her jacket. "The tape is step one." Step one had been secured. She needed step two. She called Marcus Odom from her car at 8:30 in the morning, heading north on the interstate. Marcus was 58, black, and had been the Harwell County evidence room supervisor for 23 years before his retirement 2 years prior. He had been Renata's supervisor for the first 7 years of her career in the county forensic unit and had been her professional mentor in the full sense of that word, not just the person who trained her in procedure and protocol, but the person who showed her by example and by frank conversation how to maintain integrity in an institutional environment that did not always make integrity easy or comfortable. He met her at a diner on Route 14 at 9 o'clock. He was already in a booth with coffee when she arrived, and he looked at her face when she slid into the seat across from him and said nothing for a moment. "How bad is Aaliyah?" he asked. She told him. He closed his eyes briefly. She put the forensic drive on the table between them and told him what was on it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he sat for a moment with his hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Pruitt," he said. "I've known about Pruitt for years. Every complaint that went through the evidence chain from his arrests had anomalies, testimony that was a little too clean, physical evidence that arrived a little too conveniently. I flagged 2 incidents when I was still in the office. Both times, I was told the chain of custody documentation was complete and the questions were resolved." He paused. "Both times the resolution paperwork came through Judge Birch's administrative office." "I need the archived evidence logs," Renata said. "The DEA case records for controlled substance seizures where Pruitt was the arresting officer. If he's been diverting from cartel seizures, the discrepancy will show up in the disposition records, what was logged on seizure versus what was documented as destroyed versus what the DEA's own records show." Marcus looked at her across the table. I still have my administrative credentials, he said. They expired my access when I retired, but there was a period after my retirement when I was consulting on a county audit and my credentials were reinstated. They were never properly deactivated. The IT department, he said dryly, was not known for its rigor. Marcus, I'm not asking you to do anything that puts you at legal risk. I'm 60 years old, and I watched two good cops get pushed out of that unit for asking the same questions you're asking, he said. Pull out your laptop. He opened his laptop alongside hers, and they worked through the county's archived evidence management system for the next 90 minutes, and what they found was not a surprise, but was nonetheless staggering in its documentation. Over a period of 4 years, 17 controlled substance seizures, in which either Pruitt or Webb was listed as the primary arresting officer, showed a specific pattern of discrepancy. The seizure quantity logged at the time of arrest was consistently higher than the quantity documented at the point of evidence destruction by amounts ranging from 8% to 62%. The DEA's mandatory cross-reporting system, which required the county to file parallel destruction records with the federal agency, showed quantities that matched the seizure log, meaning that someone at the county level had submitted falsified destruction records to the DEA to conceal the diversion. The financial element came from public records that Renata had already begun to pull in the days since the attack. 3 real estate holding companies registered in Harwell County over the past 5 years, all with registered agents whose names meant nothing until Marcus ran them against archived county personnel records and found that 2 of them were in the maiden name of Sandra Webb, and 1 was a variation on Leonard Birch's mother's name. The companies had acquired 6 residential and commercial properties in the county over the past 3 years, paying above-market prices in cash transactions. The cash had to come from somewhere. Marcus leaned back in the diner booth and rubbed his face. Renata. He said her name the way he used to say it when she brought him a problem in the evidence room that was bigger than it appeared on first examination. This is not a few bad officers. This is a financial enterprise with a sitting judge at the top of it. I know, she said. If you take this to the local DEA, I'm not taking it to anyone local. She looked at him. What I need from you is a signed affidavit documenting the evidence discrepancies you've identified with your name and your credentials attached. You are a 23-year county evidence supervisor. Your testimony carries weight. She paused. And I need you to tell me if there is anyone at the state or federal level you trust. He thought about that. There's an agent in the FBI's Civil Rights Division in D.C., he said. I've never met her personally, but I've read her work. She's published on evidence falsification in Southern law enforcement. Her name is Dara Simmons. Renata wrote the name in her notebook. She watched the security footage 3 more times on her laptop that evening. Not the whole footage. Just the moment at timestamp 01:33:18 when Aaliyah was already on the ground with her hands raised and Webb stood with his weapon drawn and Pruitt was moving toward her daughter with the maglite. Webb stood there for 3.4 seconds. She had counted it multiple times, had counted it until the number was as familiar as her own heartbeat. And in those 3.4 seconds, something was visible in his posture that was not visible in Pruitt's posture. Pruitt moved with the flat, uncomplicated purposefulness of a man doing something he had done before and found unremarkable. Webb stood still. It was not mercy. She was not going to call it mercy. Mercy would have meant stopping what was happening. What Webb had done was hesitate and then not stop it and then join it. But hesitation meant something. It meant the capacity for doubt, and doubt properly leveraged was a lever. She spent 1 day on public records. Property tax records showed the Webb address, a modest 2-story on Cleaver Street in the West Residential District, assessed at $211,000 with a tax arrears flag from the previous year, indicating a missed payment. A medical billing lien had been filed against the property 8 months ago by Harwell General Hospital's billing department for an outstanding balance of $47,000. The lien had been partially satisfied 6 weeks ago. A payment of $31,500 applied against the principal. She cross-referenced the partial payoff date with the departmental incident records she had already accessed through Gerald Okafor's preservation order response. The payment was applied to the lien on a Wednesday. The incident on Garfield Road had occurred the preceding Tuesday night. She pulled Sandra Webb's public medical records, not the private clinical records, which she did not access, but the publicly filed billing lien documents, which were county records and therefore accessible, and found 3 filed judgments against the household over 22 months from medical creditors, all associated with Harwell General's rheumatology department. The amounts were consistent with a complex ongoing treatment protocol for an autoimmune condition. She went to the Harwell General Hospital pharmacy records, which were also accessible through the billing portal under an employee credential she still held from a prior administrative authorization she had never been asked to relinquish when she moved from the county forensic unit to the hospital nursing staff. The records did not name the condition, but the medication list told the story clearly enough to a trained medical professional. The combination of immunosuppressant therapy, experimental biologic infusions, and supportive medications was the treatment profile for moderate to severe lupus in a patient whose disease had progressed beyond first and second-line management. Experimental biologic infusions, $9,400 per treatment every 4 weeks. Sandra Webb's insurance had reached its annual catastrophic cap 6 months ago. Renata closed the laptop. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the kitchen table. She thought about what it meant to watch your spouse suffer from something that could be managed but not cured, that could be held at bay by treatments you could not afford, that would advance without those treatments in ways that were frightening and irreversible. She thought about the specific desperation of that situation, the kind of desperation that a man might take a very wrong path to try to solve. It did not excuse him. She was not interested in excusing him. He had stood there for 3.4 seconds and then driven his knee into her daughter's back. But it told her where the crack in the wall was. On a gray Tuesday evening, she parked across Cleaver Street from the Webb house and waited. The marked cruiser pulled into the driveway at 7:14 p.m. Webb stepped out looking like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and was beginning to lose his grip on it. His shoulders rode low. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, an unusual thing for an officer who, based on his personnel photo, had always presented with the precision of someone who used the uniform as armor. He went into the house and she gave him 25 minutes, and then she walked across the street and rang the doorbell. The door opened and he looked at her and knew her immediately. He had last seen her in the ICU corridor, standing over her daughter's bed. The beer bottle shifted in his grip. She did not give him time to speak. She stepped forward to the threshold, and she named Sandra's condition and the debt and the lien payment date and the amount, $31,500, deposited 4 days after Aaliyah Cole was beaten and left on the asphalt of Garfield Road, and she told him what was on Frank Briley's tape, including the 3.4 seconds. He broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. He broke the way structures break when the stress has been building long past the load-bearing capacity, suddenly completely, with a sound that was less a sound than a giving way. He pulled the door open wider and stepped back without speaking, and she walked into the house. The living room was ordinary in the way that ordinariness can be heartbreaking family photographs on the mantel. A child's drawing on the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. A pair of medical support shoes neatly placed beside the sofa. The house of a family that was trying to hold on to its life with both hands. She sat across from him and she laid the photographs on the coffee table, 8x10 prints made from stills of the security footage, high resolution, unambiguous, and she watched him look at them and she waited. He told her what she needed to know. Pruitt had told him that Aaliyah was a spotter for a competing distribution network, that she had been documented by their informant. He had said it with the casual authority of a man who expected his account to be accepted without question. Webb had not known what they were doing until the car was already boxed in and the sequence of events had its own momentum. He had wanted to call an ambulance from the moment Aaliyah stopped moving. Pruitt had told him to get in the vehicle and had stayed at the scene long enough to pick up the phone from the asphalt. The phone, the footage of the exchange, the only independent record of what had happened on that intersection before their arrival. He had tried to access it, tried several passcode combinations, and failed. He was holding it at his lake property on Route 9 North, waiting for a technical contact from the city who could bypass the lock and wipe the device. The contact was scheduled for this coming Saturday. She asked him one question. What was the precise location of the phone? He wrote the address on the back of a utility envelope. His hand shook so badly, the pen skipped twice. She took the envelope and folded it and placed it in her pocket. She looked at him for a long moment. "You have 48 hours, she said. "Take Sandra and get out of this state. Not because I am giving you that as a favor. Because when this department comes down, I am not going to be sorting through the pieces to protect the people who participated. You cooperate with federal investigators, or you don't. That choice is yours. But you and Sandra need to be somewhere else when the structure fails." She left him sitting on the sofa with the photographs scattered across the coffee table. Thursday evening, just as Renata was parking outside the Webb house. At that same hour in the third-floor break room of the Harwell Police Department, Officer Dale Pruitt was sitting with his boots on the break room table, telling a story to two younger officers whose attention he held with the easy gravity of a man accustomed to being the authority in any room. "She came to the hospital just like they all do," he said, unwrapping a piece of gum, crying, asking questions. "I gave her the official line. She was upset." He chewed. "They're always upset. Then they lawyer up, and the union's attorney calls Gerald's attorney. And by the time it gets to Birch's docket, it's been 6 months, and the mother has used up her savings, and there's a custody dispute or a car payment or some other crisis that seems more immediate, and it goes away." He spread his hands in the gesture of something evaporating. "They all go away. That's how it works." One of the younger officers nodded. The other one was looking at the table. Pruitt didn't notice. He was in the enjoyable middle section of a story that ended with his own competence reasserting itself. Grieving mothers all break the same way, he said. It's not personal, it's physics. Friday morning, Chief Stahl called Pruitt into his office. The office smelled of the good coffee that Stahl kept in a separate machine from the department-issued variety, and of the leather of the chair that Stahl had brought from his home when he was appointed chief 11 years ago. Because the institutional furniture was, in his words, a deliberate affront to authority. Stahl sat behind his desk with the relaxed authority of a man inside his own territory and told Pruitt that the Internal Affairs Administrative Delay had been filed, that Gerald Okafor's preservation order had been received and routed to the department's legal counsel, and that Judge Birch had reviewed the situation and indicated that any civil complaint filed in Harwell County Court would face a hostile reception. The mother, Stahl said, is a nurse. She has a civil rights attorney who is known for making noise and losing cases. She has no access to the body camera footage because the body camera footage does not exist. She has an injured daughter who cannot currently provide any account of events. He folded his hands on the desk. By November, this is a civil settlement paid by the department's liability insurance and sealed by the court. Nobody goes to prison. Nobody loses their job. Pruitt nodded. He felt the particular sensation that had accompanied him through 17 years on the force, the confident, slightly pleasant awareness of being above consequences. It was not arrogance, he would have said if asked. It was evidence. The evidence of 17 years of watching consequences apply to other people. "What about the phone?" Stahl asked. "Tech contact comes down Saturday morning," Pruitt said. "It'll be formatted by noon. Whatever she recorded, it's gone by the weekend." "Good." Stahl poured himself coffee. "Enjoy the lake." Friday evening, Pruitt drove his personal vehicle, a dark gray Ford pickup, out Route 9 North toward the lake property with a bag of groceries and a case of beer in the back. The property was 30 minutes outside the city, set back from the road on a half-acre of wooded land that ended at the eastern shore of Kinsley Lake. He had owned it for 6 years. He used it on weekends when the city felt too dense and the accumulated frustrations of the work week needed somewhere to disperse. He unlocked the property, brought in the groceries, opened a beer, and went to the den. The den was his room in the full sense of the word, trophy walls, displaying the results of a decade of hunting, a custom-built wooden gun rack holding 6 rifles and 2 shotguns, a mounted largemouth bass above the fireplace, and a leather recliner positioned in front of the television. Behind the gun rack, he checked the wall safe. The phone was there, along with its other contents. He gave the dial a half-turn and let it settle, and closed the rack back against the wall. He sat in the recliner and opened the beer and watched the lake through the window until the light failed and the water went dark. He felt untouchable. He had been feeling untouchable for 17 years, and nothing in his experience had given him any reason to revise that assessment. The feeling was not in his mind a delusion. It was a track record. He finished his beer and went to bed. 42 miles away, Renata Cole was on her phone with Marcus Odom, giving him an address on Route 9 North and a DEA case number. She did not go to the lake property. This was the choice she had made sitting in her car outside the Webb house with the address written on the back of a utility envelope in a hand that had barely been able to hold the pen. She had looked at that address and she had felt the pull of it, the almost physical urgency of knowing exactly where her daughter's phone was. Knowing that the evidence of what had been done to Aaliyah was sitting in a wall safe behind a gun rack in a cabin on a lake, knowing that the man scheduled to destroy it was arriving in 36 hours. She had felt that pull, and she had held it very still, and she had thought about what she knew. She knew the inside of a corrupt institutional system, much better than almost anyone in Harwell County, because she had worked inside one for 11 years. She had processed the evidence that those officers generated. She had seen the machinery of cover-up operate at close range. And the one consistent truth, she had observed the truth that determined whether accountability actually arrived or whether it was perpetually deferred, was this: the method mattered as much as the evidence itself. Evidence obtained through a break-in was challenged as fruit of the poisonous tree. Evidence that Renata had personally touched in a property she had illegally entered could be attacked in any court in the country. A defense attorney would not need to disprove what the evidence showed. He would only need to demonstrate that the chain of custody had been broken by the person who had the most to gain from the outcome. She was not going to hand Dale Pruitt and Leonard Birch that gift. She called Marcus Odom. Marcus had the DEA's narcotics diversion reporting hotline number from his years managing the county's evidence room, which was required to maintain a standing relationship with the federal agency for purposes of disposal documentation. He dialed it from the parking lot of the Harwell County Public Library at 7 o'clock Saturday morning, using the payphone on the library's exterior wall, one of approximately 6 remaining payphones in the county, because Marcus Odom had spent 23 years thinking about how institutional actors traced communications, and he was not interested in having his cell phone associated with the tip. The report he filed was specific and technically precise, the kind of report that DEA narcotics investigators recognized immediately as coming from someone with professional knowledge of how evidence diversion worked. He cited the case number from the seized narcotics, a specific Harwell County case from 14 months prior, a cartel-connected distribution network bust, in which Pruitt and Webb had been the primary arresting officers. He cited the specific discrepancy between the county's seizure log and the DEA's cross-referenced destruction record. He provided the address on Route 9 North and a physical description of the property, with a note indicating that recovered narcotics evidence might be present on the premises. He did not provide his name. He hung up and drove home, under DEA mandatory protocol. A narcotics diversion tip, citing an active case number, triggered a federal warrant review within 24 hours. The review was initiated by a DEA supervisory special agent in the Charlotte field office at 9 that morning. By 2:15 Saturday afternoon, a federal magistrate judge, not in Harwell County, not in Judge Birch's court, not in any court over which the county's institutional network had any influence, had signed a search warrant for the Route 9 North property under the DEA's Diversion Investigation Authority. The warrant was sealed until service. At 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon, Gerald Okafor filed an emergency federal evidence preservation order, citing the DEA case number and naming both officers Pruitt and Webb and their associated properties. The order covered all physical evidence, electronic devices, financial records, and personal property on the premises of both officers. It was filed in the Eastern District Federal Court, which had jurisdiction over Harwell County, but whose administrative operations were entirely independent of the county's judicial apparatus. The preservation order was served to the Harwell Police Department at 4:47 Saturday afternoon. At 4:52, Chief Stahl called Pruitt's cell phone. "There's a federal preservation order on your properties," Stahl said. His voice was controlled, but the control was effortful, the way a man controls his voice when he is managing alarm while trying to project authority. "Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. I'm calling Birch and we'll have this vacated by Monday. It's procedural harassment." The phone Pruitt started. "Leave it where it is," Stahl said. "Moving it now would compound the problem. Trust the process." Pruitt called his tech contact and canceled the Saturday morning appointment. He poured a bourbon with slightly less assurance than the previous evening's beer and sat on the porch and told himself that Stahl had navigated worse than this, that Birch had been killing federal overreach since before Pruitt put on his first uniform, that this was a procedural inconvenience being managed by capable people. He was in bed by 10. The phone sat in the safe, legally frozen, untouched, exactly where Renata needed it to be. Sunday morning, the DEA search warrant was served. A team of 6 DEA special agents arrived at the Route 9 North property at 7:15 a.m. under the authority of the sealed federal warrant. Pruitt was not present. He had returned to the city Sunday afternoon, and the property was accessed using the warrant's provisions for entry in the absence of the property owner. In the context of a narcotic diversion investigation, the evidence recovered was logged comprehensively and photographed at each stage of recovery with the chain of custody documentation prepared by agents who understood that this case was going to be high profile and that every procedural step needed to be beyond reproach.
Inside Yaz Kushitidaif.
The wall-safe stacks of currency in rubber-banded bundles, totaling a figure that would be independently counted and documented. 3 evidence bags bearing DEA case, seals matching precisely the discrepancy between the county's seizure records and the DEA's destruction documentation. 2 small velvet jewelry boxes containing items whose origin would be traced in subsequent investigations. And on the top shelf of the safe beside a backup service weapon, a smartphone in a pale pink case with a cracked screen protector. The phone was photographed in situ before being removed. It was logged sealed in a federal evidence bag and transported to the DEA's regional evidence facility in Charlotte under documented chain of custody. Gerald Okafor received a call from the DEA's case agent at 11:30 Sunday morning. He called Renata at 11:32. She was in the ICU with Aaliyah when the call came. She stepped into the corridor to take it. She came back into the room and sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed and held her daughter's hand and stayed very still for a moment. The phone required Aaliyah's passcode. The DEA agents had tried the standard emergency bypass protocols and had encountered Aaliyah's phone's standard security architecture, which declined bypass attempts. The device required a 6-digit numeric passcode that was known in the absence of Aaliyah's ability to provide it only to the person who had discussed it with her. Adi, EA case agent, and a federal evidence technician drove to Harwell Memorial Hospital at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon. They were met in the ICU by Renata and by Gerald Okafor, who was present as Renata's legal counsel for this interaction. The agent explained the situation. The technician had the sealed evidence bag. The phone needed its passcode. Renata looked at the sealed bag for a moment, at the pale pink case visible through the evidence seal. She had known the passcode for 3 years. Aaliyah had told her when she first set it up, as she had always told her mother her passcodes since she was 14. Not because Renata had asked, but because Aaliyah believed that her mother having access to her devices was a form of trust rather than a form of surveillance, and she had offered it the way you offer a spare key to someone you trust without reservation. The passcode was the combination of 2 numbers that Aaliyah had explained to Renata with quiet deliberateness when she set it up, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago. "It's your old badge number," Aaliyah had said, "the one from when you worked at the county forensic unit." Backward. When Renata had asked her why, she had said, "Because you always told me that number meant someone was fighting for you. I want to carry it with me." Renata told the agent the passcode. The technician entered it under documented conditions with Gerald Okafor witnessing. The phone unlocked. They used a conference room at Harwell Memorial Hospital for the review, which was documented in the federal log as an evidence review conducted in the presence of the victim's parent and legal representative. The most recent video file in the camera roll was timestamped Tuesday 1:29 a.m. The DEA case agent pressed play. The footage was 4K. Aaliyah had been a meticulous person who kept her devices updated and her camera settings at their highest resolution. The audio captured by the phone's external microphone through the partially opened window was clear enough to pick up the ambient sounds of the intersection. the hiss of a distant highway, the click of the traffic signal cycling, and then, as the Tahoe arrived and the exchange began, the voices of the men in the intersection. Judge Leonard Birch's face was perfectly undeniably illuminated under the street lamp. Pruitt's voice was clear. The exchange of narcotics for money was recorded in its entirety, including the precise quantities named 50 keys from the seized cartel inventory and the reference to the percentage cut expected by Chief Stahl by the end of the week. The moment Pruitt turned and saw Aaliyah's screen was recorded with the particular horrible clarity of footage that does not know. It is about to document something terrible and records it anyway, neutrally and completely. What followed was recorded until the moment Pruitt's hand appeared in frame and ended the video. When it finished, the room was quiet. The case agent looked at his supervisor. His supervisor looked at the phone. Then he picked up his own phone and stepped into the corridor, and Renata could hear through the closed conference room door the quiet but urgent tone of a man calling someone above his current level of authority. Renata sat at the conference table and opened her laptop. She had one email to write. She had researched Agent Dara Simmons for 2 days before arriving at this moment. Simmons was 46 years old, a black woman who had spent 17 years in the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the last 9 as a field counsel in the Washington, D.C. office. She had published 14 peer-reviewed papers on evidence falsification in Southern law enforcement, on the institutional dynamics that allowed bad evidence practices to persist across consecutive administrative regimes, on the specific vulnerability of local jurisdictions where the judicial appointment process had been captured by the same political networks that were supposed to be subject to judicial oversight. Renata had read all 14 papers. She had cited 3 of them in her own county evidence room policy documentation during her final year as a forensic technician. She had never met Dara Simmons. What she knew was that Simmons was precise, thorough, and had built a career on recognizing the quality of evidence when she saw it. What Renata was sending her was not a complaint or an allegation or an emotional appeal. It was a forensic package, the kind of package that a 23-year evidence professional assembled when she wanted the evidence to be undeniable. The email contained the following attachments: the hashed and time-stamped security footage from Briley's camera with the chain of custody documentation signed by Frank Briley and witnessed by Renata with a forensic timestamp. The evidence log comparison that Marcus Odom had prepared showing the systematic discrepancy between county seizure records and DEA destruction documentation across 4 years and 17 cases with Marcus's signed affidavit attached. The public financial records tying the Shell real estate companies to Sandra Webb's maiden name and to Birch's family. The DEA case number for the seized narcotics found at the lake property. The preservation order that Gerald Okafor had filed, and a 1-page forensic summary written in the precise economical language of someone who had spent 11 years preparing documents for use in court proceedings that laid out the evidentiary chain from start to finish without rhetorical flourish or emotional appeal. The subject line read, Harwell County, PD Civil Rights Violation, Narcotics Diversion, Under Color of Law, Judicial Corruption. Evidence package attached. She also sent the complete package, the video, the chain of custody documentation, the financial records to Gerald Okafor for his files to Benjamin Crump's office, with a cover note explaining the federal context to the DOJ Civil Rights Division tip line, and to a national investigative journalist who had won a Pulitzer for police accountability reporting. To each of these, except Okafor, she included a specific request. Please do not publish or publicly disclose until federal arrest warrants have been executed, so that the department cannot destroy or relocate remaining evidence. She noted that the DEA was already in possession of the phone's video and that federal proceedings were likely imminent. She hit send. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. She drove back to the hospital through the empty late-night streets. She did not feel the particular physical release that might have been expected from the moment of sending the unburdening, the exhale. She felt instead a very particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a person who has completed a complex and demanding task and is now in the interval before the consequences arrive, when there is nothing left to do but wait, and the waiting is its own discipline. She went to Aaliyah's room. She pulled the vinyl chair close to the bed, and she opened Aaliyah's urban planning textbook to the chapter on green infrastructure in underserved communities. She had found the textbook in Aaliyah's dorm room on Thursday. When she had driven to the university to collect her daughter's laptop and her notes and her personal items in the company of the dormitory's housing coordinator, who had been kind in a way that had required enormous effort on her part to accept gracefully. Because accepting kindness required a softness she could not afford right now. She read aloud in a low, steady voice. She read about the relationship between green space and community health outcomes. She read about permeable surfaces and stormwater management. She read about the relationship between tree coverage and pedestrian safety, about urban heat islands and their disproportionate impact on lower-income neighborhoods that lacked the resources to install mitigation measures. She read about designing neighborhoods that made people feel safe. She held her daughter's hand and she read, and the machines breathed and beeped in their language, and outside across the state, across the country. In the encrypted inboxes of the people who had received her email, the payload she had built over 10 days of cold, precise, unflinching work was waiting to be opened. She did not close her eyes until nearly 3 in the morning. Wednesday morning broke over Harwell with a thin, watery light. Dara Simmons had opened the email at 11:52 p.m. Sunday. She had read the forensic summary once, reading carefully, noting the structure and the sourcing. Then she had read it again, this time with a legal pad open beside her laptop, making notes. She had been in the Civil Rights Division for 17 years, and she had received hundreds of tips and complaints and allegations and evidence packages, and she had learned to recognize within the first reading of a forensic summary whether the person who had prepared it knew what they were doing. The person who had prepared this knew precisely what they were doing. She pulled the attached chain of custody documentation for the security footage and reviewed it against the federal standard for primary video evidence. It met the standard. She pulled the evidence log comparison and checked it against the DEA case number, provided cross-referencing through the federal database she had access to as part of her Civil Rights Division credentials. The discrepancy was documented, cross-referenced, and verifiable against federal records. She opened the forensic summary again and read the final paragraph, which laid out in 11 sentences the complete evidentiary chain connecting Officers Pruitt and Webb to the beating of Aaliyah Cole, connecting Pruitt and Webb to the narcotics diversion network, connecting the diversion proceeds to the financial structures associated with Judge Birch, and connecting all of it to the institutional cover-up coordinated by Chief Stahl. She called the Deputy Assistant Attorney General at his home at 1:17 a.m. He listened for 4 minutes. He said, "Get a warrant application to me by morning." By 2:04 a.m., an emergency grand jury had been convened in the Eastern District under sealed docket. By Monday noon, the DEA's evidence from the lake property had been reviewed by the grand jury under sealed proceedings and incorporated into the federal criminal record. By Tuesday afternoon, federal arrest warrants had been issued for Dale Pruitt, Raymond Stahl, and Leonard Birch on charges that included racketeering conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and in Pruitt's case, specifically conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, the last charge arising from the DEA's determination that the beating of Aaliyah Cole had been intended to eliminate a witness to a federal crime. The warrants were sealed until Wednesday morning. Dale Pruitt arrived at the Harwell Police Department at 6:58 a.m. Wednesday, 2 minutes before his scheduled shift start. He was in a reasonable mood. Stahl had told him Monday that Birch was working on getting the federal preservation order vacated, that it was a procedural overreach that would not survive a motion, that by the time the DEA followed up on whatever anonymous tip had generated the search warrant, the relevant aspects of the situation would be legally resolved. Pruitt had accepted this with the confidence of a man whose experience told him that the institutional machinery that had protected him for 17 years was resilient. He went to his locker. He exchanged a few words with Officers Greer and McAllister, who were ending their overnight shift. He made a comment about the new duty roster that got a laugh from McAllister. He poured a cup of the department-issued coffee, which he found inferior to almost everything else available in the city, and he stood in the break room and drank it. At 7:02 a.m., every exit from the building was secured simultaneously. FBI tactical units entered from the front entrance and from the building's side access points. DEA agents entered through the rear service entrance. U.S. Marshals took positions at the building's external perimeter, including the parking structure on the building's north side. The entire operation had been coordinated in advance with the Eastern District Federal Court and with the State Police Command notably and deliberately excluding the Harwell PD's own dispatch network and command structure, because Renata's forensic summary had included a specific note to Agent Simmons explaining that Stahl monitored the department's radio traffic and that a conventionally coordinated raid would give him between 4 and 7 minutes to warn Pruitt and potentially compromise physical evidence. There was no warning. Stahl was at his desk signing morning repetitions when 2 FBI agents and a U.S. Marshal entered his office. He looked up. He looked at their jackets and the warrant that the lead agent placed on his desk, and his face moved through several expressions very quickly. Confusion, then the beginning of indignation, then something that was neither of those things and was much less comfortable. The handcuffs required adjustment twice because his hands were shaking. The officers who witnessed it from the bullpen went completely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They watched the man who had run the department for 11 years be escorted through his own office door in handcuffs, and not one of them intervened because whatever loyalty the badge generates, it does not typically extend to the moment when the institution that wore the badge is revealed as something else entirely. Pruitt was in the parking structure 3 minutes late getting to his cruiser. The 2 federal agents who were waiting for him were not in tactical gear. They were in plain clothes, standing near the entrance to the structure, with the particular quality of stillness that people who do this kind of work develop over years of practice. Pruitt saw them and assessed them correctly in the fraction of a second before they moved toward him. And his assessment was accurate, but too late. His hand went toward his service weapon. Not a decision exactly. More a response, the kind of motor program that 17 years of training had installed so deeply that it operated before the rational mind could weigh in. A U.S. Marshal's hand closed around his wrist and arm-locked his elbow against his back before the reach completed, and Pruitt was face down on the department parking lot asphalt in under 2 seconds. He was red as rights in that position, with his cheek against the concrete and the cold morning air in his lungs, and the particular sudden awareness of a man who has just run out of runway. The awareness that the 17 years of untouchability were a thing that had ended, and the new thing, the thing beginning right now with the handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists, was going to last a very long time. The charge sheet was 14 pages. Leonard Birch had been on the bench for 19 years. In those 19 years, he had sentenced an uncountable number of defendants to prison. He had done so with the gravity and the authority of the institution, with the language of the law and the symbols of its power arranged around him. The elevated bench, the seal, the robe, the gavel. All of it communicating the message that judgment in this room was the application of principle to fact by a person whose role was defined by their independence from the kind of compromised interest that drove ordinary human beings toward bad decisions. He was doing this on Wednesday morning when the doors opened. He was sentencing a 22-year-old black man named Derek Fountain for possession of a controlled substance cocaine 2 grams found during a traffic stop conducted by Officers Webb and Pruitt 14 months in prior. The stop had been conducted on a Tuesday evening on a route that ran through the Eastern Industrial District. The evidence had been processed and logged and retained through the Aaliyah County system. It had come to Birch's court through the standard Harwell County criminal procedure, unobstructed and apparently legitimate. Birch was mid-sentence, literally in the middle of the words that would assign Derek Fountain 8 months in the county correctional facility, when the main doors to the courtroom swung open and 6 U.S. Marshals walked down the center aisle in a line. The gallery murmured. The court bailiff stepped forward and then stepped back when he saw the federal identification. "Your Honor, please step down from the bench." "Step." The lead marshal's voice was clear and even projected to reach every corner of the room, including the microphones. It was not a request framed as a request. It had the grammatical form of one, but the weight of a warrant. Birch looked at the marshals. He looked at his bailiff. He looked at the prosecutor who was staring at the floor. He looked at the gallery. On what authority? Harrison Birch, federal arrest warrant, Eastern District. The charges are racketeering conspiracy to distribute Schedule 1 controlled substances, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and judicial corruption under 18 U.S.C. Section 1961. The marshal stepped to the base of the bench. "Please, step down, Your Honor." The title was used correctly procedurally, and it had never sounded so hollow. He stepped down from the bench. His legs were not steady. The robe, the black robe that was the symbol of the office, that was supposed to be the visual grammar of authority and impartiality, tangled around his ankles as the marshals took his arms and he stumbled, and there was a soft collective intake of breath from the gallery as the most powerful magistrate in Harwell County, the man who had dismissed 3 years of complaints against Dale Pruitt and had laundered cartel money through real estate shell companies, and had stood in a darkened intersection at 1:30 in the morning to collect a duffel bag, that man wept openly as the handcuffs went on in front of the cameras of 2 local news stations whose crews had been tipped by the DOJ press office 40 minutes earlier. He begged. He actually begged, the words spilling out in a frightened, undignified rush, and the marshals were not unkind about it. But they were immovable, and the camera captured it all. And by the time the footage ran on the evening broadcast and the news networks picked it up, 47 million people had already watched the other footage, Aaliyah's phone video, which the DOJ had released as part of the public arrest record at 8 o'clock that morning. The young man at the defense table, Derek Fountain, was still seated in his chair. His public defender filed an emergency motion for dismissal of all charges within the hour, citing prosecutorial misconduct and the evidence falsification associated with the arresting officer's corrupt network. The filing argued that the stop the evidence and the chain of prosecution were all products of the same institutional corruption that had just resulted in the federal arrest of the presiding judge. The motion was granted by the emergency federal judge assigned to manage the fallout from Birch's arrest. Derek Fountain walked out of the courthouse at 12:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, his charges dismissed. He had been in and out of the Harwell County court system for 4 years through 2 arrests and 1 conviction, all on cases associated with Pruitt and Webb's district. All of them were now under review. She had not anticipated this. She had anticipated many things, had anticipated them carefully, and had planned for them with the precision that 11 years of forensic work had installed as a permanent feature of her thinking. She had anticipated the department's attempts to compromise the evidence chain. She had anticipated the possibility that local federal contacts might be compromised. She had anticipated the institutional resistance of a department defending itself, and she had built around that resistance with a federal architecture that bypassed every point where local influence could apply pressure. She had not anticipated Stahl making 1 phone call from his office phone before the federal agents entered. He had 9 minutes between receiving the courtesy call from the department's union attorney, who had learned through a contact at the federal courthouse that something significant was happening, and the moment the FBI entered his office. In those 9 minutes, he had called the department's dispatch, and 2 officers who were not yet disarmed and who were not yet aware of the full scope of what was happening had been dispatched to Harwell Memorial Hospital with instructions to bring in Renata Cole on charges of evidence tampering, filing a false federal report, and criminal conspiracy. Renata was in the hospital waiting room when the 2 officers arrived. She was drinking coffee and looking at her phone, reviewing an email from Gerald Okafor about a procedural update when she looked up and saw them coming toward her and understood in the first second exactly what was happening. She did not resist. She did not argue. She went with them with the specific calmness of a woman who knows that the time remaining is a function of a progress bar she has already watched reach completion. The Harwell Police Department's basement holding cells were exactly what their name described: institutional concrete fluorescent lit cold. She was placed in cell 4, which contained a bolted-down metal bench and a drain in the floor and a clock on the wall above the cell block door that she could see through the bars. Her jacket was taken. She was not offered a phone call or medical attention for the cut on her cheek that had reopened when an officer's handling had been rougher than necessary in the processing corridor. She was not offered water. She sat on the metal bench and looked at the clock and waited. At 7:08 a.m., the cell block door opened. Chief Raymond Stahl walked in, flanked by Officer Dale Pruitt. Both of them were still in uniform, still in this interval between their arrests and their formal processing, possessing the physical markers of institutional authority. Stahl was immaculate. His silver hair was precisely arranged. His uniform was pressed. His bearing communicated a man exercising control over a situation. Pruitt leaned against the bars with the particular comfort of a man who considered it his native environment. Mrs. Cole, Stahl said, and his voice carried the warm register of condescension dressed as sympathy. You've had quite a busy 10 days. We have you on breaking and entering, evidence tampering, filing a false federal report, a conspiracy to obstruct a law enforcement investigation, and theft of departmental property. He shook his head as though genuinely regretful. You're looking at a minimum of 22 years in a federal penitentiary. Your daughter. He paused, and the pause was deliberate, is going to wake up to a mother in prison. If she wakes up, Pruitt chewed his gum. I told you, lady, he said. You should have stayed home. We found your emails. We've notified the federal contacts. We filed a counter-complaint with the Eastern District citing evidence fabrication. Whatever you thought you were building, it's built on sand. He smiled, the particular smile of a man who had used up his last piece of leverage and was presenting it as though it were still worth something. You lost. Renata raised her head. She looked at the clock on the concrete wall above Stahl's head. The clock read 7:18 a.m. What time did you think I sent that email? Raymond, she asked. His expression shifted. Barely. A micro-movement of the face. Uncertainty arriving at the edges. The email left at 11:47 Sunday night, Renata said. Her voice was raspy from the cold and the sleeplessness and the hours in the holding cell. But it was entirely steady. Completely flat. 57 hours ago. It went to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the DEA, the DOJ, Benjamin Crump's office, the New York Times, and 2 national journalists. You didn't find any emails. You found a laptop computer in my car. She looked at him. You just destroyed the receipt. The fire is already burning. Stahl stared at her. For the first time in 11 years, the first time in what she suspected was a much longer period than that, Raymond Stahl's face showed something unmanaged. The precise, cultivated expression of institutional authority cracked at its edges, and what showed through was just a man looking at something he could not stop. What the ceiling shook. It was not a subtle sound. It was the collective concussive impact of many pairs of boots on concrete stairs, moving downward fast, and it was accompanied by the metal crash of doors being hit simultaneously. At both ends of the cell block, and then by the voice of someone speaking through a tactical vest radio whose audio was partially compressed and entirely authoritative. The cell block door did not open. It was kicked. The reinforced glass panel in the door shattered inward. Through the threshold came a wave of dark windbreakers with 3 letters on the chest, and behind them the steel-gray uniforms of U.S. Marshals, and at the front of it a woman in a dark blazer who walked with the focused, purposeful stride of someone who had planned this exact approach and was executing it on schedule. Special Agent Dara Simmons, Ara. She walked past Stahl and past Pruitt, both of whom were being physically separated from each other and from the cell by federal agents before either of them had processed the situation completely. And she came directly to cell 4, and she produced a key from the officer behind her, and she unlocked the door herself, and she stepped inside. She was 46 years old. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes, when they found Renata's, were the eyes of someone who had read a forensic summary at midnight and understood immediately what kind of work it represented. Hathaway Jenkins, she said, then caught herself. Renata Cole. Yes, Renata said. I'm Agent Dara Simmons, FBI Civil Rights Division. She produced a small key for the wrist restraints. The Attorney General federalized this building at 6:15 this morning. You are free to go. We have a medical team upstairs and a vehicle ready to take you to the hospital. She unlocked the cuffs. They fell to the concrete floor with a small, cold sound. Renata stood up from the metal bench. She was stiff and cold, and her wrists ached, and the cut on her cheek had dried, but would need attention. She felt the particular quality of exhaustion that goes beyond tiredness into something physical and structural, the way a building feels when the wind has been at it for a long time. She stood up straight. In the corridor outside the cell block, Raymond Stahl was being turned by two federal agents and having his wrists placed behind his back. She heard the click of the cuffs settling. She heard the words of the Miranda warning being read in a flat, procedural voice. She watched it and felt nothing that was not already in her. Curtis Webb surrendered at 6:04 a.m. Wednesday morning. He had been in the car with Sandra for 4 days. They had driven south on the interstate on Sunday evening, 2 hours after Renata left the house with 3 suitcases and Sandra's medical kit and the address of a family member in Tennessee who had no particular knowledge of what was happening in Harwell County, but who had a spare bedroom and had said, when Webb called, that of course, come whatever you need. He had not told Sandra everything. He had told her that he had done something very wrong, that people were going to be hurt by it, that he needed to make it right in the only way still available to him. Sandra had not asked for more details than that. She had looked at him for a long time, and then she had said, then you should make it right. He walked into the DEA's field office in Charlotte at 6 in the morning with a written statement, 47 pages, composed on the laptop in the motel room while Sandra slept, that named Pruitt, Stahl, and Birch, and detailed the operation with the specificity of someone who had been an active participant in it for 3 years. He named cases, he named dates, he named the financial transfer protocols, he named the 4 other officers who had participated peripherally, who had received smaller cuts in exchange for not asking questions about certain stops in certain districts. The federal prosecutors reviewed the statement in 4 hours. They offered Webb a cooperation agreement, reduced federal sentence of 9 years, with possibility of parole at 6 full cooperation, required pension, revoked all assets associated with the criminal enterprise seized. His medical costs for Sandra's treatment would be covered under a federal victim of crime relief provision that applied to the families of officers who cooperated in the dismantling of a criminal enterprise conducted under color of law. He signed the agreement. He would serve time. He would lose the house and the accounts and the stolen money and 9 years of his life. He would lose everything he had done wrong things to try to keep. And Sandra would get her treatments. He cried in the federal conference room when the prosecutor told him about the relief provision, not the way he had cried in his own hallway with Renata standing in front of him. That had been the crying of a cornered man. This was something else. The story of Aaliyah Cole's phone footage detonated across the country at 8 o'clock Wednesday morning when the DOJ released it as part of the public arrest record pursuant to the federal transparency requirements of the civil rights prosecution. In 9 hours, the video was watched by 47 million people. The Harwell city government's website crashed from the volume of incoming traffic by 10 a.m. By noon on Wednesday, the mayor of Harwell, who had received $700,000 in police union campaign contributions over 3 election cycles and who had approved Stahl's reappointment 18 months earlier, resigned from office via a written statement released through his chief of staff citing the need to allow an independent transition of leadership during a period of institutional crisis. The Harwell Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree by noon on Thursday, its existing command structure formally dissolved and replaced by a federal oversight board pending the appointment of new permanent leadership. The Oversight Board's first act was to suspend all active officers who had served under Pruitt in the Eastern District pending individual review of their case histories. Over the following 72 hours, 41 officers were suspended pending investigation. 17 were formally indicted on charges ranging from evidence falsification to civil rights deprivation to conspiracy. 6 resigned before charges could be filed, and their resignations were noted in the federal record as potential indicators of consciousness of guilt. 3 years of recovered proceeds from the narcotics diversion network, totaling approximately $4 million, were seized by the Treasury Department and designated for restitution to the families of individuals who had been wrongfully prosecuted under Pruitt's falsified arrest reports. Derek Fountain, the young man who had been mid-sentencing when Birch was arrested, received a formal written apology from the Eastern District Federal Court. His record was expunged. He received a restitution payment for the 14 months he had spent under the terms of his wrongful conviction. He was the seventh person in the past 3 years who had been wrongfully prosecuted through Pruitt and Birch's network. The review commission established by the Federal Oversight Board identified the others. Their records were expunged. The restitution process began. Renata was not present for any of this. She was at the hospital. She had been dropped at the hospital entrance by Agent Simmons's vehicle at 9:22 a.m. Wednesday. The medical team had cleaned and closed the cut on her cheek and assessed her for hypothermia. The holding cell had been very cold, and she had been there for nearly 2 hours, and she had accepted this attention with the patience of someone who was waiting for the check on the monitor down the hall to tell her what she needed to know. She went to Aaliyah's room, and she sat in the vinyl chair, and she was there when the afternoon shift arrived, and she was there when the evening shift took over, and she sat through the long gray hours of Wednesday night in the specific suspension of a person who has done everything within her power and is now at the boundary of what power can accomplish, waiting for something that operates by its own schedule and answers to nothing that she controls. She held her daughter's hand. She read from the urban planning textbook. She waited. 8 months is enough time for the world to have rearranged itself around a catastrophe. The Harwell Police Department, reconstituted under federal oversight, had a new acting chief. A woman recruited from a reform-oriented department in a neighboring state appointed by the Federal Oversight Board with a mandate that was explicit and comprehensive, and nothing like the mandates of her predecessors. The Eastern Industrial District, Pruitt's district, had been reassigned to officers whose case histories had been reviewed and cleared. The new chief had in her first week brought in Renata Cole as a civilian evidence integrity consultant, a role that Renata accepted because the alternative leaving the institutional space to people who had not yet thought deeply about how it had failed was not one she could accept in good conscience. The consent decree required, among other things, a comprehensive review of all evidence processing protocols in the department. Renata wrote the policy document herself. It was 43 pages, and it was thorough, and it was implemented in the first 90 days of the new administration with a specificity that did not leave room for the kinds of ambiguity that had allowed the old practices to flourish. The document included as its first substantive requirement a provision for independent chain of custody audits for all body camera footage from any use of force incident to be initiated within 48 hours and conducted by an external forensic reviewer with no institutional affiliation to the department. The policy was named the Cole Protocol. The federal courtroom where Dale Pruitt was sentenced was on the 4th floor of the Eastern District Courthouse, a building of functional concrete and glass that had been built in the 1970s and had aged into a kind of institutional severity that suited the work done inside it. Pruitt sat at the defense table in a dark gray suit that did not fit him quite right. He had lost weight during his 8 months in pretrial detention, the particular weight loss of a man whose identity has been removed along with the uniform and the badge and the daily confirmation of power that both of them provided. His defense counsel, a federal public defender who had worked his case with skill and without any evident illusions about the outcome, sat beside him with the composed professional resignation of someone who had done everything possible. The case against Pruitt had been as Renata had intended it to be, airtight. His defense had spent 4 months attempting to challenge the chain of custody on the Briley security footage, arguing that Renata's involvement, as the person who had preserved it, created a conflict of interest that should result in its exclusion. The argument failed completely because the chain of custody that Renata had established that morning in Frank Briley's back office was prepared with the full technical rigor of a professional who knew exactly what a defense attorney would look for and had built against it with deliberate precision. The federal evidence technician who reviewed her documentation testified that it was, and he used this specific language, the cleanest chain of custody preservation he had reviewed in 20 years of federal evidence work. The phone footage was undeniable. Webb's testimony, delivered over 3 days of federal court proceedings, was comprehensive and corroborated by financial records, communication records, and the physical evidence recovered from the lake property. Stahl's attempted cooperation came too late, and too sparingly he tried to trade testimony for reduced charges, but had already been outflanked by Webb's earlier and more complete cooperation, and by the documentary record, which was complete enough that his testimony added texture rather than essential content. Birch refused to cooperate entirely. His attorney attempted to challenge the warrant that had authorized the search of the lake property on the grounds that the originating tip was anonymous. The challenge failed because the warrant had been issued by a federal magistrate in the Eastern District under the DEA's Diversion Investigation Authority, and the chain of evidence recovered through that warrant was independent of and prior to any action taken by Renata. On a clear morning in early spring, Federal Judge Constance Merritt, 61 years old, 3 landmark civil rights rulings in her record, and a reputation among defense attorneys for a thoroughness that left no procedural errors to appeal, sentenced Dale Pruitt to 22 years in federal prison on the consolidated charges. She sentenced Stahl to 18 years. She sentenced Birch to 2 consecutive life sentences. The pensions of all 3 men were stripped entirely. Restitution was ordered to Aaliyah Cole to Sandra Webb's medical trust. That provision, a result of a complex legal argument Gerald Okafor had advanced about the instrumentalization of Webb's desperation by the criminal enterprise, and to the 7 individuals identified as having been wrongfully prosecuted through the corrupt network. The restitution to Aaliyah was sufficient to cover her remaining educational costs, her ongoing medical expenses from the injuries she had sustained, and the beginning of what her attorney described as the compensation she was owed for the 18 months of her life that the department's actions had taken from her. Merritt looked at Pruitt before she concluded. She told him that in 20 years on the federal bench, she had seen the full range of what human beings were capable of doing to each other, that she had developed a capacity for the impartial application of law. To fact that she considered the essential discipline of her office, and that this case had tested that capacity, not because she found the facts ambiguous, but because she found them so completely clear and so entirely damning that the application of impartiality required a specific and conscious effort. She told him that he had not been a bad apple. He had been the rot that cultivated bad apples, that provided the institutional environment in which bad decisions were rewarded and good ones were penalized, and that the 17 years of his career represented not just his own choices, but the choices of every institutional actor who had decided that the maintenance of his usefulness was worth the cost of what it required. Pruitt was made to stand. The room was very quiet. He was made to face the gallery before the marshals took him. His eyes moved across the rows. They found Renata in the 3rd row. She was sitting very still with her hands in her lap and her notebook closed beside her. She was wearing a dark blazer, and her expression was the same expression she had brought to every hard thing in the past 8 months, composed, attentive, entirely present. When his eyes found hers, she gave him a slow nod. Not triumph, not satisfaction, the acknowledgement of a completed transaction, a debt recognized, accounted for, and paid in full. Then she closed the notebook, stood, and walked out of the courtroom. Aaliyah was waiting in the corridor. 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the arrests, 3 weeks before the sentencing, 3 weeks before any of the things that came after, there was a Tuesday morning in the neurological ICU at Harwell Memorial Hospital when the rhythm of the machines changed. Renata had been reading aloud. She had come to the hospital every day, sometimes twice, and she had read aloud from Aaliyah's urban planning textbook because the attending neurologist had told her, and she had confirmed through her own review of the literature, that familiar voices, familiar language, familiar rhythms of speech activated the brain's processing in ways that could support recovery from neurological injury even during the coma state. She did not know if Aaliyah could hear her. She read anyway, because the alternative, sitting in silence beside the machine that was breathing for her daughter, was something she was not going to do. She was reading the chapter on green infrastructure for the 4th time when she felt it. A faint, nearly imperceptible pressure against her right hand. She stopped reading. The pressure came again. Not a tremor, not the involuntary movement that had frightened her twice in the first weeks and turned out to be neurological activity that did not indicate consciousness. This was a different quality of movement. It had the deliberate, effortful quality of a person trying to do something specific with a body that had been still for a very long time. Aaliyah's fingers were curling around hers. Renata set the textbook down. She did not call for the nurse immediately. She stood up and leaned over the bed, and she said her daughter's name in the quiet, careful voice she used in the ICU. The voice that did not alarm or escalate. Aaliyah, baby, can you hear me? It was not a question by the time it came out. It was a statement, an affirmation directed as much at herself as at her daughter. She watched Aaliyah's face, the swelling, long subsided, the features she knew back and present, no longer. The terrible landscape of bruising, but Aaliyah's actual face, her daughter's actual face, and she watched the eyelids. They moved. The movement was slow, agonizingly beautifully slow. The heavy, resistant movement of a person returning from a very long distance, navigating back through the thick fog of sedation and neurological recovery and the profound stillness of induced unconsciousness. The eyelids lifted in increments, fighting gravity, fighting the residual weight of everything the body had been through. Aaliyah's eyes opened. They were clouded and confused, dark with the medication fog moving without focus across the ceiling for several seconds. Then slowly, as though the eyes were learning to point in a direction again, they turned. They found Renata's face. A single tear tracked down Aaliyah's cheek, slipping from the corner of her eye and moving slowly down the side of her face, and it was the most complete thing Renata had ever witnessed, that specific tear, in that specific direction, on that specific face, because it carried in it the full weight of recognition of the body, remembering the one face it had been searching for through all of that darkness. Aaliyah's mouth hishid. The breathing tube had been removed days earlier, replaced by the nasal cannula, and her lips parted, and the sound that came out was barely a sound at all. Barely more than the shape of a word pressed through vocal cords that had been resting for weeks. "Mom," Renata broke, not quietly, not in the controlled way she had broken in Frank Briley's back office, watching the footage with silent tears she did not allow to become something larger. This was the sound of the full weight of 10 days of cold precision and 2 months of institutional struggle and a lifetime of loving one specific person, releasing at once. She collapsed forward over the bed, her face in the crook of her daughter's neck, and she sobbed with a completeness and an entirety that shook her. That was not composed and not professional and not controlled. That was just a mother whose child had come back. The nursing staff in the corridor heard it. None of them came to investigate. They knew the sound. They let her have it. She stayed like that for a long time. When she straightened up and looked at her daughter's face, pale and thin and exhausted and alive and real and present, she wiped her own face with the back of her hand, and she held Aaliyah's hand between both of hers, and she did not speak for a moment because there was too much to say, and the beginning of it had to be chosen carefully. Aaliyah's eyes were tracking now, more focused, trying to read her mother's face. Her lips moved again, forming words slowly around the dryness. Did they get away with it? The question was barely audible. It was delivered in the broken, careful voice of someone working hard to make language happen after a long absence. But the specificity of it, that Aaliyah's first coherent question upon returning from 3 weeks of medically induced unconsciousness was not, "Where am I?" or "What happened to me?" but "Did they get away with it?" told Renata everything she needed to know about her daughter's character, about the mind that had come back from that darkness intact and already pointed forward. Renata looked at her. She looked at this 20-year-old woman who had been beaten nearly to death for the offense of witnessing something she was not supposed to see, who had survived, who was here and awake and asking the right question. She felt a fierce structural pride settle somewhere very deep in her chest. Not the soft pride of a parent watching a child accomplish something. The hard foundational pride of a person recognizing in another person an essential quality of character, an orientation toward truth and accountability that had survived everything that had been done to try to extinguish it. "No," my sweet girl Renata said. Her voice was wrecked from the crying, and it was completely clear. "They didn't get away with anything." She brought Aaliyah's hand up and held it against her cheek for a moment. "Mommy made sure they lost everything." Aaliyah's eyes filled again. She blinked. Her grip on Renata's hand tightened, still weak. Still the grip of a person in recovery, but present and deliberate, and unmistakably her daughter's grip. Then she closed her eyes. Not the coma's closing, not the heavy machine-assisted descent into induced stillness. The natural, easy closing of a person who is tired and safe and knows in the way. A body knows the things that matter most, that the person holding her hand is not going anywhere. She slept. Real sleep. Renata sat beside the bed in the vinyl chair and did not let go of her hand. Outside the window, the afternoon light lay long and golden across the city of Harwell, across the streets of the Eastern Industrial District and the courthouse and the federal building and the hospital parking structure and the intersection of Garfield Road and Silo Street, where an amber street lamp stood above a patch of asphalt that had been scrubbed clean of everything except what the security camera had already preserved and what the world had already seen and what no institution in the country was ever going to successfully forget. Aaliyah Cole spent 11 weeks in rehabilitation. The work was demanding and slow and punctuated by setbacks that would have broken many people, but she had not come from the kind of person who produced people who broke easily, and she moved through it with the particular patient stubbornness of someone who has a clear picture of where they are going. When she returned to Harwell State University the following fall, she changed her thesis focus. She had been planning to write about green infrastructure in underserved communities, a topic she had loved and would return to in time. Instead, she spent a year and a half developing a proposal for community oversight systems embedded in the physical architecture of law enforcement facilities, buildings designed from the ground up with transparency as a structural principle rather than an administrative afterthought, with public-facing observation areas. Independently secured evidence storage accessible to civilian audit boards, and acoustic and visual design that made the informal culture of isolation that enabled abuse physically impossible to maintain. The thesis was accepted with distinction. It was later cited by 3 separate city councils in the southeastern United States as foundational research in their establishment of civilian police review boards. She graduated at the top of her class. Her mother was in the front row. The Harwell Police Department, rebuilt under the terms of the federal consent decree, operated under a new chief whose reform mandate was both genuine and specific. In her first week, she brought in Renata Cole as a civilian evidence integrity consultant. Renata spent the first 3 months writing the policy document that would govern the department's evidence practices, a document that was thorough enough to leave no procedural ambiguity and precise enough to have been written by someone who had spent 11 years watching how ambiguity was exploited. The Cole Protocol, 43 pages implemented in full in the department's first 90 days of reformed operation, required independent forensic audits of all body camera footage from use-of-force incidents within 48 hours, mandatory dual-access logging for all evidence transfers, and a civilian chain of custody review for any case in which the arresting officer had prior complaints on record. Within its first year of operation, the protocol was adopted in modified form by 4 other departments in the state. The Federal Oversight Board cited it as a model for structural accountability reform. It was the work of a woman who had returned to the machine that had tried to destroy her family and had rebuilt it from the inside because she knew its architecture better than the people who had run it. The Harwell Police Department believed they had silenced a grieving mother. They had not calculated for what a grieving mother becomes when she has spent 11 years learning exactly how the machinery of institutional corruption is built and maintained and hidden, and decides to dismantle it from the foundation up. True power does not live in a badge or a gavel or a gun safe on a lakefront property. It does not live in an institution's ability to falsify a record or delay a complaint or bury a file in administrative procedure. It lives in the patient, precise, unflinching intelligence of a woman who sat beside her daughter's bed and chose, instead of despair, to build a case so airtight that the people who broke her daughter had no floor left to stand on when it finally came down. Renata Cole did not have powerful friends. She did not have institutional backing. She had 11 years of knowledge, a forensic drive, a borrowed pen, and a 48-hour deadline. It was enough. If this story moved you, Please subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and the people who refuse to give up.